Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're exploring Surah Al-Masad.
Oh, a fascinating one this is.
Yeah, it's a short chapter from the Quran, but you sent over some sources, and it seems like there's more to it than meets the eye, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how much impact can be packed into such a brief passage.
You know what? Maybe we should start by actually hearing the verses in English first.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. It always helps to kind of set the scene.
All right, here we go. 1. Perish the hands of Abu Lahab, and perish ease. 2. His wealth will not avail him, nor what he earned. 3. He will burn in a fire of blazing flame. 4. And his wife, the carrier of firewood. 5. Around her neck is a rope of palm fiber.
Powerful stuff, right? Even in translation, those words carry a certain weight.
Yeah, it's definitely not subtle. And that repetition of perish it at the beginning really sets a strong tone. It's so direct and personal. It's not really typical of the Quran, is it?
No, you're right. It's unusual for the Quran to explicitly name someone in a condemnation like this.
So why single out Abu Lahab by name? What makes this case so unique?
I think it highlights the severity of his actions and his persistent attempts to sabotage the Prophet's mission. It also emphasizes that worldly status and influence offer no protection when it comes to divine judgment.
What do we know about the context here? What was going on when this surah was revealed?
Well, this is what's known as a Makkan surah. It means it was revealed in Makkah in the early days of Islam when the Prophet was first starting to preach publicly. It was a pretty tense and challenging time, as you can imagine.
Makes sense. The sources you sent mentioned something about the Prophet being commanded to warn his tribe.
Yes, that's right. He was instructed to warn his own people, his tribe, about the consequences of rejecting his message. It was essentially a warning of divine punishment if they didn't change their ways.
And how do you go about that? Did he just, casually mention it over dinner or something?
Not quite. This was a big deal, and the Prophet knew it. So he chose a very dramatic way to get everyone's attention.
Oh, okay. How so?
He ascended Mount Safa and shouted, "O morning calamity!"
Wow. Oh, morning calamity. Okay, that sounds intense. What was the significance of that phrase?
Well, it was a powerful way to grab everyone's attention. You have to understand that in that culture, invoking a morning calamity was like sounding an alarm. Everyone within earshot would immediately stop what they were doing and gather, knowing that something serious was about to be announced.
It was a very deliberate strategic move.
Exactly. He knew he had to get their undivided attention, especially since this warning was directed at his own tribe, his own family.
I can only imagine the tension. So everyone gathers, they're all waiting, and then what?
He delivers his message. Then I am a warner to you before a severe punishment.
And that's where Abu Lahab comes in, right?
Yes, Abu Lahab, the Prophet's own uncle, had a very strong reaction to this warning. He publicly denounced the Prophet, saying, "Perish you, is this why you gathered us all here?"
So not exactly a supportive family member.
Absolutely not. His outburst was a deliberate act of defiance and hostility. He wasn't just disagreeing. He was actively trying to undermine the Prophet's authority and discredit his message in front of the whole tribe.
Okay, so we have this dramatic scene, this public denouncement, and this leads to the revelation of Surah Al-Masad.
Precisely. This surah is a direct response to Abu Lahab's actions, condemning him and his wife for their persistent efforts to oppose the message of Islam.
Which brings us back to those powerful verses we heard earlier, with that repeated perish directed at Abu Lahab.
Something I'm curious about is the sources mentioned a special merit attached to reciting Surah Al-Masad.
Yes.
Yeah.
It said that whoever recites this surah will be distanced from Abu Lahab on the Day of Judgment.
Interesting. So just by reciting it.
Well, it's important to understand that this merit isn't just about saying words.
So there's more to it than just rote recitation.
Exactly. It's about internalizing the message, understanding why Abu Lahab was condemned, and striving to be different from him in our thoughts and actions.
So actions speak louder than words, as they say.
Precisely. It's about reflecting on the surah's message and applying its lessons to our own lives.
Yeah, I like that. So let's get into that now. It's interesting to think about how this whole conflict between the Prophet and his uncle wasn't just a personal thing. It actually had much broader implications.
Right. It wasn't just a family feud. This was about the spread of a new faith, and Abu Lahab was directly challenging that.
Exactly. His position within the tribe gave him a certain influence, and he used it to try and discredit the Prophet and his message.
What do our sources tell us about Abu Lahab's behavior?
Well, the Tafsir al-Amthal provides some interesting insights.
Okay.
For example, it recounts how Abu Lahab would follow the Prophet around, publicly denouncing him as a liar and a sorcerer.
Oh, wow.
So this wasn't just like quiet disagreement.
Right.
This was a very deliberate attempt to undermine the Prophet's message and discredit him in the eyes of the community.
That's pretty intense.
Clearly determined to shut down the spread of Islam by any means necessary.
It sounds like it. Our source also mentions a story about Abu Lahab disrupting the Prophet's interactions with delegations visiting Mecca. What was that all about?
So apparently, whenever delegations would come to Mecca and express interest in hearing the Prophet's message, Abu Lahab would use his influence to dissuade them, spread lies, discourage them from meeting the Prophet, anything to prevent them from even considering what he had to say.
So he wasn't just expressing his own disbelief. He was actively trying to stop others from even hearing the message and forming their own opinions.
Yeah.
That's a whole other level of opposition.
Exactly. And remember, this was a time when tribal allegiances were paramount.
Right.
Yet Abu Lahab, even with the blood tie, actively sided with the Prophet's enemies.
Wow.
He even refused to sign a pact that was meant to protect Banu Hashim,
Okay.
the Prophet's own clan.
Really?
This shows just how deep his antagonism ran.
All of this really helps us to understand the context for this surah. It wasn't just like a random outburst. It was a response to a deliberate and malicious opposition. And from someone who was supposed to be family.
Right.
And, it's not just the actions themselves, but it's the unwavering nature of his opposition.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Abu Lahab, was it? His wife was also involved in trying to undermine the Prophet.
You're right. Jamil was known to be just as hostile. Some narrations even describe her as physically threatening him, like scattering thorns in his path.
Wow, that's intense. It really shows the level of opposition the Prophet faced even within his own family. I guess that's why the surah condemns them both.
Exactly. And it's interesting how the surah addresses each of them. For Abu Lahab, it focuses on his actions and his worldly status, while for Jamil, the imagery is more symbolic, highlighting her character and the consequences of her choices.
Right, let's get into that. And that leads right into the second verse. His wealth will not avail him, nor what he earned. So it's not just about Abu Lahab's actions, but also the things he valued, his attachment to worldly possessions and status.
Precisely. And this idea connects to a much broader theme in the Quran, this idea of the fleeting nature of worldly possessions. It reminds us that on the Day of Judgment, it's not our wealth or status that will save us, but the state of our hearts and the actions we take.
That's a powerful message. I think many of us can relate to that desire for security and status that comes with wealth.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very human impulse. But this verse challenges us to examine our priorities, to consider what we're truly investing in.
It makes me think about those moments when I've felt that sense of needing more, of not being enough unless I have a certain level of material wealth or social standing.
Yes, many of us experience that. But this verse reminds us that true wealth lies in righteousness and a pure heart, not in material possessions.
It reminds me of the story about Abu Lahab's death, which really brings this point home.
Ah, yes, the story of his demise is quite telling.
He refused to participate in the Battle of Badr, where the Muslims, even though they were outnumbered, achieved a decisive victory.
Yeah.
Okay, well, just a week after this battle, Abu Lahab died.
Oh, wow, that timing.
Yeah.
It seems to echo the surah's prediction.
It really does.
But what were the circumstances surrounding his death? Was it peaceful?
Not at all. Accounts from that time describe him dying from a disease that resembled the plague.
Oh, wow.
And what's even more remarkable is that his death was considered disgraceful.
Disgraceful? Wait, what do you mean by that?
Well, his body was reportedly left unburied for days.
Oh, no.
Because people were so afraid of contracting the disease.
So even in death, he was rejected.
Yes.
And when he was finally buried, it was done hastily and unceremoniously.
Far from any proper burial ground.
It's like even his own community
Rejected him.
turned away from him.
Yeah. It's a stark contrast to the honor and respect he enjoyed during his life. It really shows how fleeting worldly status can be.
It really does. And it highlights how our actions ultimately determine our legacy, not our wealth or social standing.
Okay, so the first two verses address Abu Lahab, highlighting his actions and the futility of his worldly attachments. Then the focus shifts to his wife, Jamil.
Right. Verse 3 sets the scene. He will burn in a fire of blazing flame, which is the punishment awaiting both of them.
It's so vivid the way the Quran describes the consequences of disbelief. And, the wording blazing flames, it's indefinite, isn't it? It emphasizes the intensity of this fire.
Exactly. No escaping that.
And then comes a line that always seems to spark a lot of discussion. And his wife, the carrier of firewood.
Yes, this verse has definitely generated many interpretations over the centuries.
So what's the significance of calling her the carrier of firewood? What does that actually mean?
On a literal level, some narrations suggest that Jamil would physically gather thorns and place them on the prophet's path.
Ouch.
But there are also symbolic interpretations. Carrying firewood could represent her role in fueling the fire of hatred against the prophet.
Like spreading gossip, slandering him, inciting others against him.
Exactly. She was actively contributing to that hostile atmosphere surrounding the prophet and the early Muslims.
But is that all there is to it?
There's one more layer of meaning that's quite insightful. Jamil, despite her wealth, was known for her stinginess.
Okay.
Her unwillingness to help those in need.
And then there's that line about the rope of palm fiber around her neck. Why that detail?
Well, on a basic level, it's thought to represent the punishment she'll face in the hereafter, a symbol of her being bound and restricted.
Right.
But some scholars also see it as a mockery of her worldly vanity.
Like she's trading a fancy necklace for a rough, scratchy rope.
Exactly. It highlights the emptiness of worldly adornments and how they hold no value in the afterlife.
So we have these vivid descriptions of the punishment awaiting Abu Lahab and Jamil. It's a pretty sobering message. But, if the Surah explicitly states they're destined for this punishment, does that mean they had no choice in the matter? Doesn't that contradict the idea of free will?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that Islamic scholars have been discussing for centuries. It really comes down to the interplay of divine knowledge and human free will.
So it's not like they were, pre-programmed to disbelieve. Like they had no choice in the matter.
Exactly. The Islamic understanding is that Allah's knowledge encompasses everything, including our choices, but that doesn't negate our free will. Abu Lahab and Jamil had the capacity to choose, and they chose disbelief based on their own desires.
It's a difficult concept to grasp, this idea of divine knowledge alongside free will.
It is, but think of it this way. Let's say, your best friend loves chocolate cake. Does that mean they have no choice but to eat it when offered?
Right. They still have the choice to say no, even though I know what their preference is.
Exactly. Allah's knowledge of their choices doesn't take away their freedom to make those choices.
So it's like knowing the sun will rise tomorrow doesn't mean it has no choice but to rise.
Yeah.
It's just the natural course of things.
Perfect analogy. And this brings us to another important theme from Surah Al-Masad, the emphasis on faith over blood ties.
Right, because Abu Lahab was the prophet's own uncle, and yet.
And yet, that close relationship didn't protect him from divine condemnation. It shows us that true closeness to the prophet and to Allah comes from faith and actions, not just family connections.
It's a powerful message, especially given how important tribal ties were in that society.
Absolutely. It challenged those traditional notions, emphasizing that spiritual bonds are more important. And we see this throughout the prophet's life, how he welcomed people from all backgrounds and tribes into Islam, building a community based on faith and shared values, not just bloodlines.
Like Salman al-Farsi, who became one of the prophet's closest companions, even though he had no blood relation to him.
Exactly. It's a beautiful reminder that faith is open to everyone, regardless of background, status, or lineage. What truly matters is the sincerity of our hearts and our willingness to follow the path of righteousness.
So we've covered a lot in our deep dive into Surah Al-Masad. We started with those powerful verses and the historical context of their revelation. Then we got into some deep themes about faith, free will, and the fleeting nature of worldly attachments.
And even though it's so short, this chapter offers so much wisdom that's still relevant to us today.
It really makes you think, if blood ties don't guarantee salvation, what responsibility do we have towards our own families and loved ones when it comes to sharing knowledge and guiding them?
It's something to think about for sure. How can we embody compassion and concern, not just for ourselves, but for those closest to us? That might be one of the most important lessons from this surah.
Absolutely. Surah Al-Masad may be short, but it's incredibly powerful and relevant to us even today. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.